In a Fort Carson conference room, a corporate lawyer was about to discover his biggest mistake. What started as a routine procurement meeting took a shocking turn when he came face to face with the commanding general. Reyes wasn't your typical attorney. For 15 years, he had climbed corporate ladders, known for his sharp intellect and superiority complex. When he encountered his sister Elena wearing general's stars, he had no idea he was walking into career humiliation. Marcus had dismissed Elena's military dreams as, quote, playing soldier. What began as sibling rivalry would become devastating reckoning. The family would never recover after his client addressed his failure sister as General Ma'am. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The holographic display cast blue shadows across the briefing room as Major General Elena Reyes moved her pointer across the three-dimensional model of the MATV retrofit specifications. 23 officers sat at attention around the polished conference table, their eyes tracking her every gesture. The morning Colorado sun slanted through the windows of Building 1500, but Elena commanded the room's focus with the same precision she'd once used to direct convoy movements through hostile territory. The armor enhancement package increases survivability by 43%, she stated, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned leadership under fire. But weight distribution remains our primary concern. Captain Morrison will brief logistics coordination with the contractor teams. Elena's gaze swept the room, cataloging each officer's expression. Colonel David Parks sat at her right, his tablet stylus poised over notes that she knew would be organized with military precision. They'd developed this rhythm over years of shared briefings, him anticipating her needs, her trusting his judgment. It was the kind of professional partnership that made command effective, the kind she'd learned to value more than personal relationships. Questions? Elena asked, though her tone suggested the briefing was complete. Lieutenant Colonel Reyes raised his hand. Ma'am, what's the timeline for contractor presentations? Thursday morning. Morrison Defense, Blackwater Systems, and Titan Manufacturing. Elena's expression remained neutral, though Park noticed the slight tension in her shoulders at the mention of the meetings. Colonel Park will coordinate the security briefings. As the officers filed out, Elena remained standing at the display, her reflection ghost-like in the holographic projection. The armored vehicle rotated slowly, its specifications scrolling past in neat columns of data. Everything about the briefing had been precise, controlled, successful. Yet Park sensed the familiar undercurrent of something unresolved. General? Park's voice carried the careful tone he used when Elena's emotional barriers were particularly high. The Morrison meeting prep is scheduled for 1500. Elena nodded, dismissing the hologram with a gesture. The room suddenly felt larger, emptier. Morrison's team includes their legal counsel this time. Corporate wants every detail documented. Park gathered his materials, watching Elena from his peripheral vision. In Afghanistan, he'd learned to read her moods like weather patterns. Today carried the atmospheric pressure of an approaching storm. Elena's phone buzzed against the conference table. The display showed Carmen beneath a photo of her sister's smiling face, one of the few personal touches Elena allowed on her military-issued device. She stared at the screen for 3 rings before answering. Carmen. Elena, hi. Carmen's voice carried the gentle persistence that had made her an excellent nurse practitioner and a persistent family mediator. I know you're busy, but I wanted to talk about this weekend. Elena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Park, still organizing files, recognized the shift immediately. This weekend? Elena repeated, her tone carefully neutral. Papa's anniversary. It's been 3 years, Elena. I thought maybe we could visit together this time. Marcus said he might. Marcus said he might what? The words carried more edge than Elena intended. Carmen's pause spoke volumes. He's been asking about you. About your promotion. I think he wants to reach out, but you know how he is with admitting he was wrong. Elena moved to the window, her back to Park. The view showed the main parade ground where soldiers conducted morning PT, their movements synchronized and purposeful. Everything here made sense. Everything followed protocol and hierarchy and merit. I have the contractor meetings this week. Thursday's presentation is critical for the retrofit program. Elena, it's Sunday. You could fly out Saturday night, fly back Sunday evening. 2 hours at the cemetery, that's all I'm asking. Park quietly excused himself, recognizing Elena's need for privacy. His footsteps echoed down the corridor as Elena watched recruits march across the parade ground below. Carmen, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but when was the last time you visited Papa's grave? The question hung between them like incoming artillery. Elena's reflection in the window showed a woman who'd earned 2 stars through competence and determination, who commanded respect from subordinates and superiors alike. But Carmen saw past the uniform to the sister who'd left home at 18, with nothing but hurt feelings and determination. I send flowers every year. That's not the same thing. Elena's free hand traced the window frame, her fingers finding a small scratch in the paint. The timing isn't good. The timing is never good with you. There's always another briefing, another deployment, another promotion ceremony. Carmen's voice carried the weight of years of attempted reconciliation. He's our father, Elena. Whatever happened between you and Marcus, Papa didn't choose sides. The parade ground had emptied, leaving only the geometric precision of painted lines and regulation spacing. Elena could command thousands of soldiers, coordinate million-dollar operations, make life and death decisions under fire. But her sister's voice could still reduce her to the 18-year-old who'd left home feeling like she had something to prove. I'll think about it. Carmen knew better than to push. I love you, Elena. Papa would be proud of what you've accomplished. After the call ended, Elena remained at the window. Park returned 20 minutes later, finding her reviewing contractor files with the methodical focus she used to avoid emotional complications. Morrison Defense sent their updated personnel list, he reported, setting the documents on the conference table. Their legal team includes Marcus Reyes from Hartwell Morrison and Associates. Elena's pen stopped moving across the page. She looked up at Park, her expression carefully composed. Family name, she said simply. Park nodded, understanding more than he revealed. Years of serving under Elena had taught him when to probe and when to simply acknowledge. Should be straightforward. Morrison's always been professional. Elena returned to her files, but Park noticed her reviewing the same page twice. Outside, the afternoon light shifted toward evening, casting longer shadows across the briefing room. The contractor meetings would determine millions in funding, impact hundreds of soldiers, safety, influence procurement decisions across multiple commands. But as Elena prepared for what should have been routine presentations, she couldn't shake the feeling that Thursday would bring more than business discussions. Some battles, she'd learned, followed you home no matter how far you traveled from the field. Marcus's hand trembled slightly as he flipped through the recruitment brochures scattered across Elena's desk. The glossy pages showed soldiers in combat gear, helicopters against desert skies, young men and women in dress blues receiving medals. He'd found them hidden beneath her calculus homework, and now he stood in her bedroom doorway, holding the evidence of what he considered her latest act of rebellion. Elena! His voice carried the authority of someone who'd learned early that being the oldest meant being in charge when their parents worked double shifts. 16-year-old Elena emerged from the bathroom, her dark hair still damp from the shower. She saw the brochures in Marcus's hands and her chin lifted with the defiance that had marked her personality since childhood. Those are mine. Army recruitment? Marcus's voice cracked with disbelief. At 19, he was home from USC for winter break, wearing the confidence that came with Dean's list grades and a pre-law track that made their mother beam with pride. Elena, what the hell are you thinking? Elena snatched the brochures from his hands, her movements quick and protective. I'm thinking about my future. Something you wouldn't understand since yours was handed to you. The accusation stung because it carried truth Marcus wasn't ready to acknowledge. He'd been the golden child since birth. The one who read early, tested well, never questioned the path their parents had outlined for academic success. Elena had always been different, asking uncomfortable questions, choosing the difficult route, making their mother worry. "Hand it to me?" Marcus's laugh held no humor. "I earned a full scholarship, Elena. I study while you're out playing soccer and pretending you're going to be some kind of warrior princess. It's not pretending." Elena's voice carried a quiet intensity that made Marcus pause. "I've been talking to Sergeant Santos at the recruitment office. There are programs for college, for officer training. You could what? Play dress-up soldier until reality hits?" Marcus moved closer, using his height advantage the way he'd learned to use his academic achievements as weapons when he felt threatened. "Elena, you barely passed chemistry. You think the military is going to make you into something special?" The bedroom door opened wider as their father Eduardo appeared, still wearing his mechanic's coveralls from the garage where he worked evenings after his day job at the Postal Service. Eduardo Reyes had the weathered hands of a man who'd worked physically demanding jobs his entire life, and the careful posture of someone who'd learned to make himself small in a world that didn't always welcome him. "¿Qué pasa aquí?" Eduardo's question carried the weariness of a man who'd refereed too many fights between his children. Marcus turned to their father, the recruitment brochures clutched in his fist like evidence in a trial. "Papa, Elena thinks she's going to join the army. She's throwing away her education for some fantasy about being a soldier." Eduardo's eyes moved from Marcus to Elena, and she saw something flicker across his expression, something that looked almost like recognition. Their father had never talked much about his own youth, about the choices he'd made or hadn't made, but Elena had always sensed there were stories he kept locked away. "Mija," Eduardo said softly, "the military, it's a hard life, especially for women. Especially for people like us." Elena felt the familiar weight of being different, of wanting things that didn't fit the careful path her family had carved toward respectability and stability. Marcus was going to be a lawyer, successful and safe. Carmen was in nursing school, respectable and practical. Elena was supposed to find something appropriate for a young Latina woman from East LA, teaching, maybe, or healthcare, like Carmen. "I know it's hard, Papa. But I'm not afraid of hard." Rosa appeared behind Eduardo, her nurse's scrubs exchanged for the faded jeans and oversized sweater she wore at home. She'd been working double shifts at the county hospital, and exhaustion showed in the lines around her eyes. "Elena, amor, why would you want to put yourself in danger? You have opportunities we never had. You could go to college, study something safe." "Safe?" Elena repeated the word like it tasted bitter. "You mean safe like being quiet, like not asking for too much, like knowing my place." Marcus felt the conversation spiraling away from his control. "Elena, that's not what they mean. They mean practical. Realistic. You want to honor the family? Get an education. Become something respectable." "Respectable according to who?" Elena's voice rose. Years of feeling like the family disappointment finally finding expression. "According to you? According to people who think girls like me should be grateful for whatever scraps we can get?" Eduardo raised his hand, the gesture that had always meant silence in their household. The room went quiet except for the distant sound of traffic on Whittier Boulevard and the neighbor's television through thin walls. "Elena," Eduardo said carefully, "Marcus is right about education. The military. It's not always what the brochures promise." Elena looked at her father, seeing something in his expression she'd never noticed before. "Papa, did you ever think about joining? When you were young?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Eduardo's hands, scarred from years of mechanical work, flexed unconsciously. Rosa's sharp intake of breath suggested Elena had touched something that was meant to stay buried. "That was different," Eduardo said finally. "Different time, different opportunities." But Elena had seen the answer in his eyes before he'd hidden it. She'd seen regret and longing and the ghost of dreams that had been sacrificed for practicality and family responsibility. Marcus watched the exchange with growing unease. He'd always been the one who understood their parents' expectations, who fulfilled their ambitions for upward mobility through education and professional success. Elena's military fantasies threatened the narrative that made his achievements meaningful. "Elena, you're being selfish," Marcus said, his voice carrying the cold precision he was learning to use in debate class. "You want to throw away everything Mom and Dad have worked for so you can chase some Hollywood fantasy about being a hero." Elena turned to face her brother fully, and Marcus saw something in her expression that made him step back. It wasn't anger. It was determination, pure and unwavering. "I don't want to be a hero, Marcus. I want to be something more than what people expect from me. Something more than safe and small and grateful." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more force than shouting. "I want to matter." The room fell silent again, but this time the quiet felt different. Elena had articulated something that none of them had been willing to say, that their careful pursuit of respectability felt like settling, like accepting limitations imposed by other people's low expectations. Marcus felt something crack inside his chest, a hairline fracture in his certainty about their family's hierarchy and his own superior position within it. But instead of examining that uncomfortable feeling, he did what he'd learned to do when challenged. He attacked. "You'll never amount to anything playing soldier, Elena. You're not smart enough, not tough enough. You're going to end up exactly where you started, except with fewer options and more regrets." The words left his mouth before he could stop them, cruel and calculated to wound. Elena's face went pale, but her expression didn't change. If anything, her resolve seemed to strengthen. "We'll see," she said quietly. The McDonald's on Whittier Boulevard wasn't the kind of place where life-changing decisions usually happened, but Elena found herself sitting across from Sergeant First Class Miguel Santos at a corner booth, the recruitment paperwork spread between them like battle plans. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the smell of French fries mixed with the diesel exhaust from buses stopping outside. Santos was nothing like the recruitment posters. 43 years old with graying temples and hands that showed years of manual labor before he'd found his calling in the army. His uniform was pressed sharp, but his voice carried the rough edges of someone who'd grown up in neighborhoods like this one. "Your ASVAB scores are solid, Reyes. Electronics, mechanical comprehension. You've got the aptitude for technical fields." Santos slid a pamphlet across the table. "Signal Corps, maybe transportation. Fields where you can build skills that translate to civilian careers." Elena nodded, but her attention drifted to the window where she could see Marcus's Honda Civic pulling into the parking lot of the law office where he'd started his internship. Even from a distance, she could see his confident stride, the way he carried himself like someone who belonged wherever he went. "What about combat arms?" Elena asked. Santos's eyebrows rose slightly. "Most women choose support roles. Better for career progression. Safer for—" "I didn't ask what most women choose." Elena's voice carried the same quiet intensity that had silenced Marcus during their bedroom confrontation 2 weeks earlier. "I asked about combat arms." Santos studied her face, recognizing something he'd seen in other recruits from neighborhoods like East LA, the hunger to prove something to a world that had already decided their limitations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Infantry's opening to women in limited roles. It's harder, more dangerous. Why put yourself through that when you've got the scores for specialized training? Elena's fingers traced the edge of the pamphlet, her mind drifting to the conversation she'd overheard between her parents the night before. Rosa pleading with Eduardo to talk sense into their daughter, Eduardo's conflicted murmurs about duty and opportunity, and the dangers of reaching too high. "My brother thinks I'm playing dress-up," Elena said finally. "He thinks I don't have what it takes to be a real soldier." Santos leaned back in the plastic booth, understanding flooding his expression. He'd seen this before. Kids joining the army to prove something to family members who'd written them off, to neighborhoods that had labeled them as statistics, to themselves when the doubt crept in during quiet moments. Reyes, you joining to prove something to your brother? Or you joining because you want to serve? The question hit harder than Elena expected. She thought about the recruitment brochures she'd hidden, about the way her heart had raced when she'd first walked into the recruitment office, about the dreams that felt too big for the small apartment where she'd grown up watching her parents work multiple jobs just to keep them afloat. Both, she admitted. Santos nodded slowly. Fair enough. Just remember, the army doesn't care about your family drama. Once you're in, it's about the mission and the soldiers next to you. Everything else is just noise. Elena's phone buzzed with a text from her manager at the grocery store, where she'd been working 20 hours a week to save money for basic training expenses. Another double shift available, more money toward the independence that felt so close she could taste it. At home, the tension had become a living thing that followed Elena through the cramped apartment. Marcus paraded his law school acceptance letters like trophies, each scholarship offer and academic honor, a subtle reminder of the path their parents had wanted for both their children. Carmen tried to play peacemaker, but her gentle suggestions that Elena think practically felt like betrayals from the sister who was supposed to understand. The worst part was Eduardo's silence. Elena would catch him watching her sometimes, his expression unreadable, as if he was seeing something in her that reminded him of roads not taken. She'd started noticing things, the way he straightened when military personnel appeared on television, how his hands would unconsciously smooth his work shirt when news reports showed soldiers in dress blues receiving commendations. One evening, while helping her father change the oil in Mrs. Gonzalez's car, Elena had found them. The military records and discharge papers were tucked behind a photo in Eduardo's toolbox, along with a purple heart that had never been displayed, and letters of recommendation for officer candidate school that had yellowed with age. "Papa," Elena had whispered, holding the purple heart in her palm like something sacred. Eduardo had taken the medal from her hands, his fingers gentle against the worn ribbon. Vietnam. Different war, different time. You never told us. Some things are better left buried, Mija. But Elena had seen the way his shoulders straightened when he held the medal, the pride he'd hidden from his family for reasons she was only beginning to understand. Her father had served, had been wounded, had earned recognition for his sacrifice. And somehow that service had become a source of shame rather than honor. Now, sitting across from Santos in the fluorescent-lit McDonald's, Elena understood why her military dreams felt like both betrayal and destiny. "When do I sign?" she asked. Santos pulled out his pen, but paused before handing it to her. "Reyes, once you sign these papers, you're committed. Basic training, then advanced individual training, then whatever the Army needs from you. Your family gonna support this decision?" Elena thought about Marcus's cruel prediction, about Rosa's worried pleas, about Eduardo's hidden medals and buried dreams. She thought about the way people in their neighborhood looked at military families, with respect mixed with pity, honor shadowed by fear. "My family doesn't get to choose my battles anymore," Elena said, accepting the pen. As she signed her name on the enlistment papers, Elena felt something shift inside her chest. Not just determination, but a kind of freedom she'd never experienced. For the first time in her life, she was choosing her own path, even if it led through territory her family couldn't understand. Outside, the California sun was setting behind the smog-hazed mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Elena folded her copy of the enlistment papers carefully, knowing that when she walked through the door of their apartment tonight, she would be carrying more than documents. She would be carrying the weight of a decision that would change everything. Santos gathered his materials, but his expression remained serious. "Reyes, you got heart, but the Army's gonna test more than your determination. You ready for that?" Elena met his gaze steadily. "Sergeant, I've been ready my whole life." Quote, the mahogany podium gleamed under the USC Law School auditorium lights as Marcus Reyes stepped forward to receive his diploma, summa cum laude, Order of the Coif, Law Review Editor-in-Chief. The applause washed over him, like validation made audible. 3 years of 18-hour days and caffeine-fueled study sessions, culminating in this moment of recognition. His parents sat in the third row, Rosa clutching Eduardo's hand, both of them wearing the careful pride of people who'd sacrificed everything to witness their son's triumph. Carmen beamed from beside them, her nursing school pin catching the light. The empty seat next to Carmen, the one they'd left for Elena, remained a glaring absence that Marcus had trained himself not to notice. Marcus Reyes, the dean announced, graduating summa cum laude, recipient of the Outstanding Achievement in Constitutional Law Award. Marcus crossed the stage with the confidence he'd cultivated like armor, shaking hands with professors who'd opened doors he'd never imagined walking through. But as the camera flashes captured his smile, he found himself scanning the audience for a face that wouldn't be there. Elena was somewhere in Georgia, finishing basic training at Fort Benning, too far away and too stubborn to acknowledge what real success looked like. Later, at the reception, Marcus accepted congratulations from classmates who would scatter to prestigious firms across the country. Partners from Hartwell, Morrison & Associates, the firm where he'd start as an associate in September, approached with handshakes and promises of challenging cases. "Outstanding work on the Constitutional Law Review article," said James Morrison Sr., the firm's managing partner. That analysis of military tribunal jurisdiction showed real insight. Marcus nodded, accepting the praise while pushing away the memory of Elena's recruitment brochures, the way she'd talked about serving something larger than herself. Military law was just another academic exercise to him, a theoretical framework for understanding power and procedure. "Thank you, sir. I'm looking forward to contributing to the firm's military contracting practice." Morrison's smile held the satisfaction of a man who'd identified valuable talent. "You'll fit right in, Reyes. We need bright young lawyers who understand the complexities of defense work." That night, in his small apartment near campus, Marcus called home to share the details his parents couldn't have understood from the ceremony alone. Rosa's voice carried across the phone line, thick with emotion and the exhaustion of a double shift at the hospital. "Mijo, we're so proud. Your father kept saying, 'That's my son, that's my Marcus,' to everyone around us. How was the party?" Eduardo's voice came from the background, and Marcus could picture his father still in his good shirt, the one he wore to church on special occasions. "Good, Papa. The partners from my firm were there. They said I made a strong impression." There was a pause, and Marcus knew his parents were processing the magnitude of what he'd accomplished. Their son, the first in their family to graduate from law school, already positioned for success at a prestigious firm. "Elena called yesterday," Rosa said carefully, testing the waters of a subject they'd all learned to navigate delicately. "She finished her training. They're sending her to some school for—" "Mom, can we focus on tonight?" Marcus interrupted, his voice sharper than he'd intended. "This is kind of a big deal." The silence that followed carried the weight of a family, learning to function around an absence none of them quite knew how to address. Elena had left for basic training 3 months earlier, and her departure had created a vacuum that made every family celebration feel incomplete. 2 years later, Marcus stood in the conference room at Hartwell Morrison & Associates, reviewing the case files that had just earned him a significant victory against a major defense contractor. The client was a small logistics company that had been wrongfully excluded from a military supply contract, and Marcus's research had uncovered procedural violations that forced a settlement worth millions. He should have felt triumphant. The partners had already hinted at an accelerated track to senior associate, and his name was being mentioned for high-profile cases that could establish his reputation. But as he sat alone in the conference room, surrounded by evidence of his competence and success, Marcus felt the peculiar emptiness that had begun to characterize his achievements. His phone displayed 17 missed calls from colleagues and clients offering congratulations, but the person he wanted to call, the person who might understand the magnitude of what he'd accomplished, was somewhere in Afghanistan, according to Carmen's last update. Elena had been promoted to lieutenant, was leading some kind of supply unit, but Marcus had deflected the conversation before Carmen could share details. The promotion news had irritated him more than he'd expected. Lieutenant sounded impressive to people who didn't understand military hierarchies, but Marcus knew it was basically an entry-level management position. Elena was probably supervising truck drivers or managing inventory. Hardly the glamorous combat role she'd fantasized about as a teenager. At the firm's annual gala 6 months later, Marcus met Sarah Chen, an environmental lawyer whose quick wit and understated confidence reminded him of the intellectual partnerships he'd valued in law school. She was beautiful in a way that suggested substance rather than ornament, and when she laughed at his story about a particularly difficult client, Marcus felt something ease in his chest that he hadn't realized was tense. Defense contracting law, Sarah mused over her wineglass. That must be fascinating, all the government regulations and military protocols. Marcus nodded, appreciating her genuine interest. It's complex. A lot of people don't understand how much legal expertise goes into supporting military operations. Do you have military background yourself? The question was casual, conversational, but it hit Marcus like a small electric shock. No, just academic interest. Though my sister… He trailed off, surprised by his own admission. Your sister? She's in the army. Deployed overseas. Marcus's voice carried a dismissive tone that had become automatic when Elena's career entered conversations. Different path, different priorities. Sarah nodded, but Marcus caught something in her expression, a flicker of respect that felt like a rebuke to his own dismissal. Later that evening, as Sarah laughed at something he'd said about the partners, golf obsessions, Marcus felt the familiar sensation of success tinged with incompleteness. He was building a life that looked perfect from the outside: prestigious career, beautiful girlfriend, financial security that his parents had never imagined possible. But underneath the surface achievements, something felt hollow, like a victory won in an empty stadium. The feeling followed him home to his upgraded apartment in Beverly Hills, through the congratulatory calls from partners discussing his partnership track, past the framed law school diplomas that validated years of effort. Marcus had everything he'd been taught to want, everything his family had sacrificed to make possible. So why did success taste like something was missing? The Georgia heat pressed down like a living thing. As Elena low-crawled through the red clay mud of Fort Benning's confidence course, her M16 slung across her back, and 70 pounds of gear grinding against her spine. Drill Sergeant Martinez's voice cut through the humid air like artillery fire. "Move it, Reyes! Your battle buddy's counting on you." Elena's muscles screamed as she army-crawled under the concertina wire, feeling the barbs catch at her uniform. Behind her, Private Jennifer Walsh struggled to keep pace, her breathing ragged in the suffocating heat. Elena had learned in the first week that basic training stripped away everything except what mattered: mission accomplishment and taking care of soldiers. "Stay with me, Walsh," Elena whispered, slowing her pace just enough to let the younger woman catch up. "We finished together." It had taken Elena 3 weeks to find her rhythm at basic training. The physical demands were brutal but manageable. Years of high school soccer had given her a foundation of endurance and mental toughness. What surprised her was how naturally she took to the leadership challenges, the way other recruits started looking to her when the drill sergeants created problems that required quick thinking and teamwork. By graduation, Elena stood in the front rank of her platoon, Distinguished Graduate Medal weighing against her chest. But more importantly, she'd discovered something Marcus's academic achievements had never given him: the profound satisfaction of being part of something larger than individual success. Officer candidate school at Fort Lewis brought different challenges. The academic workload rivaled anything Marcus had faced in law school, but Elena thrived on the combination of intellectual rigor and practical application. Military history, logistics theory, leadership psychology, subjects that connected to real-world consequences in ways that made every lesson feel vital. Second Lieutenant David Park sat next to Elena in their military decision-making process class, his notebook filled with the same meticulous attention to detail she'd noticed in their study groups. Park was 2 years younger than Elena, but carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd found his calling early. "Reyes," Park said during a break between tactical exercises, "you ever think about your branch assignment?" Elena looked up from her logistics manual, where she'd been studying supply chain vulnerabilities in austere environments. "Transportation Corps, probably. Or maybe Signal." Park raised an eyebrow. "With your leadership scores, you could probably get infantry if you wanted it." Elena considered this. The military was slowly opening combat roles to women, and she'd watched the debates with interest. But logistics appealed to her strategic mind. The complex puzzle of moving people and equipment across vast distances, the way successful supply operations could determine the outcome of entire campaigns. "I want to go where I can make the biggest difference," Elena said finally. "Afghanistan's heating up. Lots of convoy operations, IED threats. Logistics officers are taking on combat roles whether the policy says so or not." Elena nodded, thinking about Marcus's dismissive comments about her playing soldier. If only he could see the complexity of what she was learning. Multi-million-dollar budgets, international logistics coordination, the life and death calculations that kept soldiers fed, armed, and equipped in hostile territory. Her first deployment came 8 months later, Forward Operating Base Shank in Logar Province, Afghanistan, where the mountains stretched endlessly toward Pakistan and every road could hide an improvised explosive device. Elena arrived as a first lieutenant, assigned to the 15th Transportation Company as a platoon leader responsible for convoy operations throughout the region. The Phoebe smelled like diesel fuel, burning trash, and the indefinable scent of a place where thousands of people lived in temporary structures designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Elena's platoon consisted of 30 soldiers, most of them younger than she was, all of them depending on her judgment to bring them home alive from missions that grew more dangerous each week. Lieutenant Park had arrived 2 weeks earlier, assigned to the intelligence section. Their reunion felt like finding family in a place where relationships could mean the difference between life and death. "Reyes," Park greeted her as she dropped her duffel bag in the officers' quarters. "Heard you got the roughest supply route in sector." Elena nodded, already studying the maps that showed Highway 1 stretching toward Kabul through territory where Taliban fighters had been increasingly active. "Guess they figured I needed the challenge." The challenge came sooner than expected. 3 weeks into her deployment, Elena's convoy of 5 vehicles was moving medical supplies to a combat outpost when the lead truck hit an IED outside the village of Baraki Barak. The explosion flipped the 20-ton vehicle, trapping the driver and injuring 3 soldiers. Elena's training took over like muscle memory. While medics worked on the wounded, she established a security perimeter and called for helicopter evacuation. But the Taliban fighters who had triggered the ambush weren't finished. Small arms fire erupted from compounds on both sides of the road, pinning down her soldiers behind damaged vehicles. "Park, I need you to coordinate with the QRF." Elena radioed to the intelligence section back at base, her voice steady despite the bullets cracking overhead. "We're taking effective fire from multiple positions." For the next 40 minutes, Elena maneuvered her soldiers through a complex tactical situation that would have challenged a combat arms officer with years of experience. She directed suppressive fire, coordinated medical evacuation, and ultimately led a flanking movement that allowed her convoy to break contact and reach safety. The Bronze Star citation that arrived 6 months later would describe her actions in the formal language of military awards: exceptional leadership under fire, and tactical proficiency that resulted in the preservation of lives and mission accomplishment. But for Elena, the medal represented something more profound: proof that she belonged in situations where competence wasn't measured by test scores or family expectations, but by the trust of soldiers who followed her into danger. The success brought rapid promotion to captain, then major, along with assignments that showcased her growing expertise in complex logistics operations. Elena earned a master's degree in strategic studies through the Army's continuing education program, writing her thesis on supply chain vulnerabilities in asymmetric warfare, research that would influence doctrine at the highest levels of military planning. But success came with personal costs she hadn't anticipated. The call about Rosa's heart attack came while Elena was planning a mission to resupply an isolated outpost in Helmand Province. "Cancer," the doctors said. "Advanced. Inoperable. Maybe 6 months if they were lucky." Elena's commander granted emergency leave, but by the time she reached Los Angeles, her mother was already gone. The funeral was a blur of relatives she barely recognized, flowers that smelled too sweet, and Carmen's quiet tears that seemed to fill the silence where Elena's own grief should have been. Marcus spoke at the service about Rosa's sacrifices for her children's education, her pride in his achievements, her dreams of seeing her family succeed in America. He never mentioned Elena's military service, never acknowledged that Rosa had kept newspaper clippings of Elena's promotions hidden in her jewelry box. Carmen found the clippings later, when they were cleaning out their mother's belongings. "She was proud of you," Carmen said, showing Elena the carefully preserved articles about her Bronze Star, her promotion to major, her selection for advanced military education. "She just didn't know how to say it." Elena held the yellowed newsprint, reading descriptions of her own achievements in her mother's careful handwriting. Rosa had followed her military career from a distance, collecting evidence of Elena's success while maintaining the family narrative that academic achievement was the only path worth celebrating. Standing in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by the detritus of a life that felt increasingly foreign, Elena realized that her military family had become more real than the one she'd grown up with. Park and the soldiers she'd led, the officers who'd mentored her, the institution that had recognized her abilities without question, they had given her something her blood family never could. But the newspaper clippings suggested that maybe, in her own quiet way, Rosa had understood what Elena had found in the army. Maybe she'd known all along that some dreams were worth pursuing even when they led away from everything familiar and safe. Elena folded the clippings carefully, tucking them into her dress uniform pocket. Tomorrow she would return to Afghanistan, to missions that mattered and soldiers who depended on her judgment. The grief would follow her, but so would the knowledge that she'd built something meaningful from the determination that had carried her away from Marcus's cruel predictions. Some battles, Elena had learned, were won not through dramatic gestures, but through the quiet accumulation of competence, trust, and service to something larger than family approval. Marcus's fingers drummed against the mahogany conference table as he spread the Morrison defense contract files across its polished surface, each document representing months of preparation for what could be the defining case of his career. The Beverly Hills offices of Hartwell, Morrison & Associates hummed with the quiet efficiency of expensive legal work, but Marcus felt the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach as he reviewed specifications for armored vehicle retrofits that might as well have been written in a foreign language. 3 years had passed since he'd made senior associate, 2 since his marriage to Sarah, and 6 months since the Morrison defense account had landed on his desk, like a career-defining gift wrapped in military jargon he'd spent countless hours learning to decode. The contract was worth $47 million, and James Morrison Jr. had specifically requested Marcus to handle the legal complexities of military procurement regulations. The Pentagon meeting is crucial, Morrison had explained during their initial consultation, his weathered hands gesturing at technical drawings that Marcus pretended to understand completely. "We're competing against Blackwater Systems and Titan Manufacturing for the MATV armor upgrade contract. Our legal presentation needs to be flawless." Marcus had nodded with the confidence he'd cultivated like a professional skill, masking the imposter syndrome that had followed him from law school through every major case. The difference was that Morrison defense contracts operated in a world Marcus had deliberately avoided understanding. The military sphere, where his sister had built her career, while he'd focused on corporate law that kept him safely distant from anything resembling Elena's choices. Now, surrounded by technical specifications for ballistic protection systems and IED-resistant vehicle modifications, Marcus couldn't escape the irony that his biggest professional opportunity required expertise in the very field he'd dismissed as Elena's, quote, playing soldier. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Dinner with the Chens at 8. Don't forget." Marcus glanced at his Rolex, 6:30 p.m. He'd promised Sarah he'd be home by 7, but the Morrison files demanded more review time. The meeting at Fort Carson was Thursday morning, less than 48 hours away, and Marcus still felt unprepared for questions that might require more than legal expertise. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent 15 years building a career that had led him to this moment, representing defense contractors in meetings with military officials whose world he'd never bothered to understand. Elena's world. Morrison Defense had provided him with briefing materials about Fort Carson, background on the procurement process, and profiles of key military personnel who would attend the meeting. Marcus had memorized the organizational charts and protocol requirements, but something about the upcoming presentation filled him with a dread that went beyond normal pre-meeting anxiety. "Working late again?" Sarah's voice came from the conference room doorway, her tone carrying the gentle concern of someone who'd watched her husband's stress levels climb steadily over the past month. Marcus looked up from a technical manual about armor steel specifications, his expression shifting to the smile he used when he needed to reassure his wife that everything was under control. "Just reviewing the Morrison materials one more time. This contract could make my career, Sarah." Sarah moved into the room, her eyes taking in the scattered documents, the empty coffee cups, the evidence of obsessive preparation that had characterized Marcus's work on the Morrison account. "Marcus, you've been preparing for weeks. You know this case better than anyone." Marcus gathered the files with movements that suggested controlled panic rather than confidence. "Military procurement law is different. The regulations are complex, and I can't afford to miss anything. When's the last time you took a real break? Maybe we should postpone dinner with—" "No." Marcus's voice carried more edge than he'd intended. "I'm fine. Just focused." Sarah studied her husband's face, recognizing the tension that had become his default expression whenever the Morrison case entered their conversations. "Marcus, is this about the military aspects of the case? Because you know it's okay to admit when something is outside your expertise." The suggestion that he might be out of his depth struck Marcus like a physical blow. He'd built his identity on intellectual superiority, on being the smartest person in any room he entered. Admitting uncertainty about military protocols felt like acknowledging that Elena's career choice might have given her knowledge he lacked. "I'm handling it fine," Marcus said, his voice taking on the defensive tone that had become familiar between them. "It's just complex legal work." His phone rang, interrupting the tension. Carmen's name appeared on the display, and Marcus felt his stomach clench with anticipation of another conversation about family obligations he wasn't prepared to handle. "I should take this," Marcus said, gesturing toward his office. "Carmen, hi." Marcus's voice carried the careful neutrality he'd learned to use with his sister. "Marcus, I know you're busy, but I wanted to talk about this weekend. It's Papa's anniversary, and I really think—" "Carmen, this isn't a good time. I have a major presentation on Thursday, and it's one afternoon, Marcus. 2 hours at the cemetery. Elena might even—" "Elena?" Marcus's voice sharpened involuntarily. "What about Elena?" Carmen's pause carried the weight of years of failed family mediation. "She's stateside right now, some kind of assignment at Fort Carson. I thought maybe if we could all—" Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. Fort Carson. The same Fort Carson where his meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning. The same military base where Elena was apparently stationed, doing whatever it was that Army officers did when they weren't deployed to combat zones that Marcus had trained himself not to think about. "Marcus, are you there?" "Yeah, Carmen, I can't make it this weekend. The Morrison case requires my full attention." "Marcus, it's been 3 years since Mama died. Don't you think it's time?" "Carmen, I have to go. We'll talk after Thursday." Marcus ended the call before Carmen could respond, his hands trembling slightly as he set the phone on his desk. Elena was at Fort Carson. Elena, whose military career he'd dismissed for 15 years, whose achievements he'd deflected in every family conversation, whose very existence he'd learned to compartmentalize away from his professional success. Thursday morning, he would walk into a military installation where his sister might be working, might be one of the officers evaluating his presentation, might witness him struggling with terminology and protocols that were probably second nature to her. Sarah appeared in his office doorway, her expression concerned. "Marcus, you look pale. What did Carmen want?" Marcus looked up at his wife, seeing genuine worry in her eyes. For a moment, he considered telling her about Elena's proximity to Thursday's meeting, about the family dynamics that had shaped his reaction to military service, about the growing fear that his biggest career opportunity might expose him to the very person whose achievements he'd spent years minimizing. Instead, he reached for the professional mask that had served him through every difficult moment of his legal career. Just family stuff. Nothing that can't wait until after Thursday? But as Sarah left him alone with the Morrison files, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Thursday morning would bring more than a business presentation. Some confrontations, he was learning, followed you no matter how carefully you planned your route around them. The Fort Carson briefing materials lay open on his desk, organizational charts and protocol summaries that suddenly felt like enemy intelligence rather than helpful preparation. Somewhere in those charts might be his sister's name, her rank, her role in the very meeting that was supposed to establish his expertise in a field she'd made her life's work. Marcus closed the files and leaned back in his leather chair, staring at the diplomas and awards that lined his office walls. All the evidence of his success, all the validation of his intellectual superiority, and none of it seemed adequate preparation for the possibility of facing Elena across a conference table where she belonged, and he was still learning the language. The security checkpoint at Fort Carson's main gate processed Marcus and James Morrison with the efficient precision of a military installation that had hosted thousands of contractor meetings. Marcus adjusted his tie for the third time as their rental car followed the MP's directions toward Building 1500, his palms damp despite the Colorado morning's crisp air. "First time on a military base?" Morrison asked, noticing Marcus's careful attention to the passing formations of soldiers conducting morning PT. "Yes, sir." Marcus kept his voice steady, though his chest felt tight with an anxiety that went beyond normal pre-meeting nerves. "I've handled plenty of defense contracts, but always from the civilian side." Morrison nodded, his weathered face showing the satisfaction of a man returning to familiar territory. "Different world in here. Military folks appreciate directness, competence, and respect for the chain of command. The general we're meeting has a hell of a reputation. Youngest female general in the Army, decorated combat veteran, knows logistics better than most civilians know their own business." Marcus's stomach clenched at the mention of a female general, but he pushed away the irrational fear that had been building since Carmen's phone call. Fort Carson was a massive installation, with thousands of personnel. The chances of Elena being involved in this meeting were mathematically insignificant. Building 1500 rose before them like a monument to military efficiency, its concrete facade marked only by the unit crests and flags that indicated the presence of senior leadership. Marcus gathered his briefcase and followed Morrison through glass doors that reflected the morning sun like armor. The reception area hummed with the controlled activity of a military headquarters. Staff officers moved with purposeful efficiency, their boots clicking against polished floors that could have doubled as mirrors. A young captain escorted Marcus and Morrison through corridors lined with photographs of previous commanders, their faces staring down with the stern dignity of leaders who had earned their positions through service rather than corporate networking. "Conference Room Alpha," the captain announced, opening double doors that revealed a space designed for high-level decision-making. A mahogany table dominated the center, surrounded by chairs that faced a presentation screen and multiple flag stands representing various commands and units. Marcus took his assigned seat, noting the nameplate that read, "Morrison Defense Contractors," in precise military lettering. Around the table, other contractors were reviewing their materials, representatives from Blackwater Systems and Titan Manufacturing, along with military personnel whose ranks and decorations spoke to years of professional experience. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Colonel Park from the head of the table, "please rise for the commanding general." Marcus stood with the others, his attention focused on his notes until Morrison's sharp intake of breath made him look up. Through the conference room's side door walked a figure in army dress blues, the uniform crisp and perfectly fitted, 2 silver stars gleaming on the shoulder boards like badges of authority that demanded immediate recognition. Major General Elena Reyes entered the room with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, her presence shifting the atmosphere from professional courtesy to genuine respect. Marcus felt the world tilt sideways as he stared at his sister who was supposed to be playing soldier, his sister who would never amount to anything, his sister who now wore the rank of a general officer and commanded the deference of every person in the room. "General, ma'am," Morrison said immediately, his voice carrying the automatic respect of a former Marine addressing a superior officer. Elena's gaze swept the room with the measured assessment of a leader taking stock of her environment. When her eyes met Marcus's, her expression remained perfectly neutral, giving no indication that she recognized the corporate lawyer sitting among the contractor representatives. "Good morning," Elena said, her voice carrying the authority that comes from years of making decisions that affect thousands of lives. "Welcome to Fort Carson. I'm Major General Reyes, Commanding General of the 4th Infantry Division." Marcus felt his mouth go dry as Elena moved to the head of the table, accepting the briefing materials that Colonel Park handed her with the easy efficiency of a practiced partnership. This was his sister, the same person he'd dismissed as playing dress-up soldier, the same woman whose military aspirations he'd mocked as unrealistic fantasies. The MATV Armor Retrofit Program represents a critical capability gap for our forward-deployed units, Elena continued, her briefing delivered with the confidence of someone who understood both the technical specifications and their real-world applications. "We're looking for solutions that enhance survivability while maintaining operational mobility in contested environments." Morrison leaned forward with obvious interest, his respect for Elena's expertise evident in his focused attention. Around the table, other contractors took notes, while Elena outlined requirements with the detailed knowledge of someone who had actually used this equipment in combat zones where mistakes cost lives. "General, if I may," Morrison interjected when Elena paused for questions. "Morrison Defense has extensive experience with retrofit programs in theater. Our technical approach addresses the weight distribution challenges while improving ballistic protection by 43%. Elena nodded, reviewing Morrison's materials with the careful attention of a leader who understood that procurement decisions affected soldiers under her command. "Mr. Morrison, your company's track record in Afghanistan was impressive. The retrofit work on the 2019 deployment showed real innovation under pressure." Marcus watched this exchange with growing disbelief. Morrison was treating Elena with the deference he usually reserved for senior partners at major law firms, and Elena was responding with the easy competence of someone completely comfortable in her authority. Elena's voice carried the patient tone she used when explaining obvious things to people who should already know them. "But Marcus is there for business? This is amazing. Maybe you two could—" "Carmen, it's complicated." "What's complicated? You're both adults, you're both successful. Maybe it's time to put the past behind you." Elena looked around her quarters, the military furniture, the unit citations, the photographs of soldiers she'd led in combat, and tried to imagine explaining to Carmen that the past wasn't something you put behind you when it had shaped every day of your adult life. Marcus spent the morning learning that his sister outranks most colonels and has the respect of defense contractors he's trying to impress, Elena said carefully. "I don't think he's processing it well." Carmen's pause carried the weight of family dynamics she'd never fully understood. "He saw you in uniform? As a general? Complete with Morrison Defense's legal counsel calling me General Ma'am, while Marcus took notes on regulations I helped write. Oh my God, Elena, how did he react?" Elena thought about Marcus's expression when Morrison had praised her expertise, the way his confidence had crumbled, as she demonstrated knowledge that made his legal preparation seem inadequate, like someone whose entire worldview just collapsed. Across town at the Marriott, Marcus sat at the hotel bar nursing his third whiskey and staring at his laptop screen, where he'd opened Elena's military biography on the Fort Carson website. The photograph showed her in dress blues, her expression carrying the confident authority he'd observed that morning. Below the photo, her military education and command experience read like achievements that dwarfed his own professional accomplishments. Bronze Star with Valor, Masters in Strategic Studies, combat deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq, command of multiple transportation units, recognition for innovative logistics solutions that had saved lives and improved operational efficiency. Marcus scrolled through Elena's accomplishments with the growing realization that while he'd been building a career on legal technicalities, his sister had been earning recognition for competence under conditions where mistakes had life-and-death consequences. Morrison approached the bar, his expression showing the satisfaction of a successful businessman who'd identified valuable partnerships. "Marcus, perfect timing. I just got off the phone with our technical team. General Reyes asked some questions that really impressed our engineers. She clearly understands the real-world applications better than most acquisition officers." Marcus closed his laptop, unable to read any more evidence of Elena's expertise. She certainly seemed knowledgeable. Knowledgeable? Morrison laughed, settling onto the adjacent bar stool. Marcus, that woman is legendary in logistics circles. The convoy operations she ran in Afghanistan are studied at the War College. When Morrison Defense Equipment performs well under her command, it's like getting an endorsement from the best in the business. Marcus drained his whiskey, feeling the alcohol burn against the growing certainty that everything he'd believed about Elena, about himself, about their family hierarchy, had been catastrophically wrong. Morrison, hypothetical question, Marcus said, echoing Elena's earlier conversation with Park. What happens when you realize you've completely misjudged someone's capabilities for 15 years? Morrison studied Marcus's face with the attention of someone who'd spent decades reading people for professional advantage. Depends on whether you're smart enough to learn from the mistake. Why? Marcus gestured toward his laptop, where Elena's biography remained open like evidence in a case against his own judgment. General Reyes is my sister. Morrison's whiskey glass stopped halfway to his lips. Your sister? Elena Reyes is your sister? Marcus nodded, watching Morrison's expression shift from surprise to something approaching awe. Marcus, do you have any idea how remarkable your sister is? I mean, not just as a military officer, but as a leader? The soldiers who serve under her would follow her anywhere, and the contractors who work with her compete for her approval because it means something in this business. Quote, General, Morrison continued, I'd like you to meet my legal counsel, Marcus Reyes from Hartwell, Morrison & Associates. He's been instrumental in navigating the procurement regulations for this contract. Elena's gaze shifted to Marcus, and for a moment that felt like an eternity, brother and sister stared at each other across a conference table where she belonged, and he was suddenly, completely out of his depth. Mr. Reyes, Elena said, her voice maintaining perfect professional neutrality. I trust you're familiar with the federal acquisition regulations governing military procurement? Marcus opened his mouth to respond with the confident expertise he'd cultivated for 15 years, but found himself staring at the two stars on Elena's shoulders. Stars that represented an authority and competence he'd never imagined she could achieve. Yes, General, he managed, his voice sounding strange in his own ears. Extensively familiar. Elena nodded and moved on to the next contractor, leaving Marcus to process the complete destruction of every assumption he'd held about his sister's capabilities and his own superior position in their family hierarchy. The meeting continued around him, but Marcus heard it as if from a great distance, his attention fixed on Elena as she demonstrated a mastery of complex technical and strategic issues that made his own legal expertise seem suddenly, humiliatingly inadequate. The conference room emptied with the measured efficiency typical of military meetings, but Elena remained seated at the head of the table, her hands folded over the Morrison defense proposal, as if the documents could anchor her to the professional composure that had carried her through the past 90 minutes. Around her, the detritus of a successful procurement briefing, empty coffee cups, scattered notepads, the lingering scent of Morrison's cologne, felt surreal in the aftermath of seeing Marcus's face drain of color when Morrison had introduced him. Colonel Park approached with the careful attention to detail that had made him invaluable during her command tenure. General, the Morrison proposal addresses most of our technical requirements. Their retrofit timeline is aggressive but achievable. Elena nodded, forcing her mind back to armored vehicle specifications and deployment schedules. Schedule follow-up meetings with their technical team. I want detailed weight distribution analyses before we make any recommendations to TRADOC. Yes, ma'am. The Blackwater presentation is scheduled for 1400, and Titan Manufacturing follows at 1600. Park paused, his expression suggesting he'd noticed something in Elena's demeanor that warranted attention. Everything all right, General? Elena's gaze moved to the empty chair where Marcus had sat, his legal pad still bearing the nervous doodle she'd observed him making throughout the meeting. For 15 years, she'd imagined what it might feel like to face Marcus as an equal, or better yet, as his superior. The reality felt nothing like vindication, and everything like a wound that had been surgically reopened. Just processing the technical details, Elena said, gathering the briefing materials with movements that suggested control rather than calm. Morrison's legal counsel seemed overwhelmed by the procurement complexity. Park's eyebrow raised slightly. He'd noticed Marcus's obvious discomfort. The way the lawyer had fumbled basic questions about federal acquisition regulations that any defense contractors counsel should have mastered. Some civilian lawyers struggle with military procurement law, Park offered diplomatically. Different world from corporate contracts. Elena stood, her dress uniform crisp despite the morning's tension. Different world entirely. In the corridor outside the conference room, Marcus walked beside Morrison, with legs that felt disconnected from his body, his mind struggling to process what had just occurred. The general who had commanded the room's respect, who had demonstrated mastery of technical specifications that made Marcus's legal expertise seem peripheral, who had been addressed as General Ma'am with genuine deference. That was Elena. His sister Elena, who according to his carefully maintained narrative, should have washed out of basic training years ago. Impressive briefing, Morrison said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a businessman who'd identified a promising partnership. General Reyes really knows her stuff. I've worked with a lot of military leaders, but she's got that rare combination of technical expertise and strategic vision. Marcus nodded mechanically, his throat too tight for coherent response. Morrison's praise for Elena felt like physical blows, each compliment destroying another piece of the superiority complex Marcus had built his identity around. The procurement process will be competitive, Morrison continued, but having worked with General Reyes on previous contracts, I'm confident we can meet her requirements. She's demanding but fair, and she actually understands what our equipment needs to accomplish in real-world conditions. Previous contracts? Marcus managed, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. Afghanistan, 2018. Her unit was conducting some complex logistics operations, and our retrofit equipment performed exceptionally under her command. She wrote one hell of a performance evaluation for our gear. Morrison's respect for Elena was obvious in every word. That's why I specifically requested her for this procurement review. When General Reyes endorses equipment, the entire Army logistics community pays attention. Marcus felt his carefully constructed worldview crumbling like a building with faulty foundations. Elena hadn't just succeeded in the military. She had achieved a level of professional recognition that made Morrison, a man who commanded millions in defense contracts, speak of her with genuine reverence. They reached the parking lot where their rental car waited, and Marcus fumbled with his briefcase, buying time to process what felt like a complete inversion of reality. Morrison checked his phone, scrolling through emails with the easy confidence of someone whose meeting had exceeded expectations. I'm staying at the Marriott tonight, Morrison said. Early flight tomorrow, but I want to review our technical specifications one more time. You should join me for dinner. We can discuss strategy for the follow-up meetings. Marcus nodded automatically, though the prospect of analyzing Elena's technical questions over dinner felt like psychological torture. Of course. Whatever you think is best. Excellent work today, Marcus. Your preparation really showed. Morrison's praise, which should have felt like professional validation, instead highlighted Marcus's growing awareness that his preparation had been woefully inadequate for the reality of dealing with Elena's expertise. Back in Building 1500, Elena closed her office door and stood at the window overlooking the parade ground where soldiers conducted afternoon training. The familiar sight usually provided a sense of grounding, a reminder of the institution that had given her purpose and recognition when her family had offered neither. Today it felt like sanctuary from the emotional complexity of seeing Marcus struggle with procurement regulations that Elena had mastered years ago. Colonel Park knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a privilege earned through years of reading Elena's moods and providing the kind of professional support that made command sustainable. The Morrison follow-up is scheduled for next week, Park reported, settling into the chair across from Elena's desk. Their technical team wants to address your questions about weight distribution and maintenance requirements. Elena nodded, but her attention drifted to the commendation certificates that lined her office walls: Bronze Star, Meritorious Service Medal, combat deployment awards that documented years of service Marcus had never bothered to understand. Park, hypothetical question. Elena's voice carried the careful tone she used when approaching sensitive subjects. If you discovered that someone you'd known your entire life had completely misjudged your capabilities, how would you handle that information? Park considered the question with the thoughtful attention he brought to strategic planning. Depends on the relationship, I suppose, and whether the misjudgment was malicious or just ignorant? Both, probably. Then I guess the question becomes whether you want vindication or reconciliation. Sometimes you can't have both. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from Carmen. "Call me when you get a chance." Marcus said, "You're both at Fort Carson?" The message carried an undercurrent of hope that made Elena's chest tighten with familiar family obligation. "Park, clear my schedule for an hour. I need to make some phone calls." 30 minutes later, Elena sat in her base housing quarters, staring at Carmen's contact information while trying to formulate words for a conversation she'd never imagined having. How do you explain to your sister that your brother, the golden child, the successful lawyer, the family's pride, had just been professionally humiliated by the sibling he'd spent 15 years dismissing? When Carmen answered, her voice carried the eager hope of someone who'd spent years trying to rebuild broken family connections. "Elena, Marcus told me about the meeting. Are you both actually at Fort Carson right now?" "I'm stationed here, Carmen. Have been for 6 months." Each word of Morrison's praise felt like a hammer blow against Marcus's ego. "We haven't been close." "That's a shame. You should be incredibly proud of what she's accomplished." Morrison's tone carried the respect of someone who understood achievement in worlds beyond corporate law. General Reyes represents the best of military leadership, competent, principled, effective under pressure. The Army doesn't hand out general stars to people who are just playing at being soldiers. Marcus ordered another whiskey, knowing that alcohol wouldn't numb the growing realization that Elena had become everything he'd claimed she could never be, while he'd built a career that suddenly felt peripheral to anything that mattered. "Morrison, I think I need to make some phone calls." "Of course. Family is important, Marcus. Especially family like that." As Morrison left him alone at the bar, Marcus stared at his phone, Carmen's contact information highlighted but not yet dialed. "How do you explain to your sister that you've spent 15 years being wrong about everything that mattered? How do you apologize for cruelty that had shaped someone's entire life? And how do you admit that the person you'd dismissed as a failure had achieved success you were only beginning to understand?" The whiskey tasted like regret, and Marcus knew that tomorrow's hangover would be the least of his problems. Carmen Reyes had learned the art of family crisis management during her 15 years as a nurse practitioner, where emergency situations required swift assessment, clear communication, and the ability to remain calm while everyone else lost their composure. But as she sat in her rental car outside Fort Carson's main gate at 6 o'clock Friday morning, she wondered if her professional skills would be adequate for the family emergency that had brought her from Los Angeles on a red-eye flight. Both phone calls had come within hours of each other. First Elena, her voice carrying the controlled tension that meant she was processing something significant while maintaining military composure. Then Marcus, drunk and rambling about misjudging Elena's capabilities, about Morrison's respect for their sister, about 15 years of being wrong about everything that mattered. Carmen had listened to both siblings with the patience she'd developed for trauma patients, letting them talk through their shock while she assessed the scope of the damage. Elena was hurt but not surprised. Marcus was devastated and struggling to reconstruct his entire understanding of family hierarchy. Both were avoiding the conversation that needed to happen, so Carmen had done what she'd been doing since childhood. She'd appointed herself the family mediator and bought a plane ticket. The security checkpoint processed her visitor credentials with military efficiency, and soon she was following directions to Building 1500. Where Elena had agreed to meet her for breakfast before duty hours began. The Colorado morning was crisp and clear, the kind of weather that made difficult conversations feel possible rather than inevitable. Elena was waiting in the officers' dining facility, her ACU uniform pressed and professional, her coffee cup empty in a way that suggested she'd been sitting there for a while. Carmen had always marveled at how the military had shaped Elena's posture, straight-backed and alert in a way that commanded respect from anyone who understood body language. "You flew out here," Elena said as Carmen approached, her tone carrying equal parts gratitude and exasperation. "Carmen, you didn't need to. Both my siblings are in the same place for the first time in 3 years, and one of them just discovered the other is a general officer. Yeah, I needed to fly out here." Carmen settled into the opposite chair, studying Elena's face for signs of emotional stress beneath the professional composure. "How are you holding up?" Elena's laugh held no humor. "Yesterday, Marcus learned that his kid's sister outranks colonels and has the respect of defense contractors he's trying to impress. Today I get to figure out whether vindication feels better or worse than I imagined. Carmen recognized the deflection strategy Elena had perfected over years of avoiding family emotional complexity. Elena, this isn't about vindication, this is about two people who've spent 15 years hurting each other because neither one knew how to admit they were scared. Scared? Elena's voice carried the edge that appeared whenever someone suggested her military achievements were motivated by anything other than professional calling. I wasn't scared of anything, I was following my own path. You were terrified that Marcus was right about you not being smart enough or tough enough. And Marcus was terrified that you were choosing a path he couldn't follow because he wasn't brave enough. Elena's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. What are you talking about? Carmen had spent years as the family translator, interpreting motivations that her siblings couldn't acknowledge to themselves. Elena, why do you think Marcus resented your military choice so much? It wasn't because he thought you were throwing your life away. It was because Papa wanted to serve, and Marcus knew he could never measure up to that legacy. The dining facility hummed with the quiet activity of soldiers preparing for duty, but Elena felt suddenly isolated in her understanding of family dynamics she'd never questioned. Papa never talked about military service, because it was too painful. He applied for officer candidate school twice, and was rejected both times, not for lack of ability, but because of circumstances. Limited English, no college degree, family obligations. When you announced you were joining the army, Marcus saw you pursuing the dream Papa had been forced to give up, and he couldn't handle the comparison. Elena set down her coffee cup with movements that suggested careful control, so he decided to destroy my confidence instead. He decided to protect his position as the family success story by convincing everyone, including himself, that military service wasn't a real achievement. The conversation was interrupted by Carmen's phone, buzzing with a text from Marcus. At hotel, hungover but ready to talk if Elena wants to. The message carried the humble tone of someone whose worldview had been thoroughly demolished. Carmen showed Elena the text, watching her sister's expression shift from professional neutrality to something more complex, hurt mixed with curiosity, vindication tempered by the possibility of something resembling forgiveness. He wants to talk, Carmen said simply. Carmen, I don't know if I'm ready for that conversation. Yesterday was a lot to process. Carmen leaned forward, using the gentle pressure she'd learned was effective with patients who needed encouragement to face difficult procedures. Elena, what would Papa want you to do? The question hit like incoming artillery. Elena's jaw tightened as she considered her father's values: duty, family, service to something larger than personal grievances. Eduardo Reyes had taught his children to honor their commitments even when the cost was personal comfort. Papa would want us to act like family. Then let's go see Marcus. But first, there's somewhere we need to stop. 2 hours later, Carmen's rental car pulled into Fairview Cemetery in Colorado Springs, where Eduardo Reyes had been buried 3 years earlier, in a plot that reflected the military service he'd never been able to discuss with his children. Carmen had discovered the veterans' section location through hospital social services, understanding that her siblings needed to confront their father's legacy before they could address their own relationship. Elena and Marcus stood on opposite sides of Eduardo's grave, their body language suggesting two people who'd found themselves in unfamiliar territory, without clear protocols for navigation. Marcus looked like he'd spent the night processing more alcohol than sleep, while Elena maintained the military bearing that had become her default response to emotional complexity. The gravestone was simple granite with military markers. Eduardo Reyes, Sergeant, United States Army, Vietnam veteran, Purple Heart. Below the official information, Rosa had added, beloved husband and father. He never told us about the Purple Heart, Marcus said, his voice carrying the hoarse quality of someone who'd spent hours reconsidering fundamental assumptions. Carmen opened her purse and withdrew a manila envelope. Mama kept things. I found them when we cleaned out the house. Inside were Eduardo's discharge papers, medical records documenting shrapnel wounds that had never fully healed, and letters of recommendation for officer candidate school that had been submitted but never accepted. At the bottom of the stack were newspaper clippings, every article about Elena's military achievements that had appeared in local papers, carefully preserved with dates written in Rosa's handwriting. Elena stared at the clippings, recognizing her own face in photographs from promotion ceremonies and medal presentations. Mama kept these? She followed your career from the beginning. She was proud, Elena, but she didn't know how to say it because she was scared. Scared that being proud of your military success meant admitting Papa's dreams had been valid. Marcus picked up one of the newspaper articles, reading about Elena's Bronze Star citation for leadership under fire. The description of her tactical competence and soldier care read like achievements that dwarfed his own professional accomplishments. Elena, I owe you an apology. Marcus's voice carried the weight of someone finally acknowledging 15 years of cruelty. I was wrong about everything. Your capabilities, your achievements, your reasons for serving. Elena looked up from the newspaper clippings, her expression guarded. You were wrong about a lot of things, Marcus. I know. And I know saying sorry doesn't erase what I said to you, how I dismissed your dreams. Marcus paused, struggling with words that felt inadequate for the scope of his mistakes. I was protecting myself by tearing you down, and that was unforgivable. Carmen watched her siblings with the careful attention of a medical professional monitoring vital signs. This was the moment when family healing either began or became permanently impossible. Marcus, why did Papa's military service threaten you so much? Elena asked, her tone carrying genuine curiosity rather than accusation. Marcus knelt beside Eduardo's grave, his fingers tracing the military insignia carved into granite. Because I knew I could never measure up to what he represented. Physical courage, service to something larger than yourself, leading people in situations where your decisions matter life and death. I built my identity on being the smart one because I was too scared to try being the brave one. Elena absorbed this admission, recognizing the fear that had motivated years of family dysfunction. Marcus, intelligence and courage aren't mutually exclusive. You could have what? Joined the military at 35 as a lawyer? Elena, you earned your rank through combat leadership. I've spent 15 years arguing about contract details. Carmen intervened before the conversation could spiral into comparative suffering. You're both successful in different ways. Papa would be proud of both his children, the daughter who followed his military dreams and the son who achieved the educational success he never had. Elena stood, brushing dirt from her uniform knees. Marcus, your legal work supports military operations. Morrison Defense Equipment saves soldiers, lives because lawyers like you navigate the regulations that get gear to combat zones. Marcus looked up at his sister, really looked at her for the first time in 15 years, seeing not the stubborn teenager who defied family expectations, but the professional military officer who commanded respect through competence earned under fire. Elena, Morrison spoke about you like you're legendary in military circles. He said contractors compete for your approval because it means something. Morrison's good at his job. We work well together because we both understand what equipment needs to accomplish in real-world conditions. Real-world conditions, Marcus repeated, the phrase carrying weight as he processed the gap between his theoretical understanding and Elena's practical experience. I've been reviewing your biography, Afghanistan, Iraq, Bronze Star for leadership under fire. Elena, you've been doing things that matter while I've been arguing about contract clauses. Elena's expression softened slightly. Marcus, your work matters too. Military operations depend on legal frameworks. Just because my job involves more obvious danger doesn't make it more important. Carmen felt the shift in energy as her siblings began finding common ground rather than defending territory. You know what Papa would say if he could see you both right now? Elena and Marcus looked at Carmen expectantly. He'd say that family is the most important mission, and everything else is just details. Elena reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew her father's dog tags, the ones she'd carried through basic training, OCS, and every deployment since. She'd worn them as a reminder of dreams deferred but not forgotten, of service that connected generations even when families couldn't find words for that connection. Papa's legacy isn't about who followed his path or who achieved more success, Elena said, placing the dog tags on Eduardo's grave. It's about service, to country, to family, to something larger than ourselves. Marcus stood, his expression carrying the humility of someone who'd discovered that competence came in forms he'd never recognized. Elena, I spent 15 years being wrong about you. Can we start over? Elena studied her brother's face, seeing past the expensive suit and corporate confidence to something that looked like genuine remorse. Marcus, starting over means acknowledging what happened. It means understanding that your words shaped my entire adult life. I know, and I want to understand. I want to learn about what you've accomplished, what your service means. I want to be the brother you deserved instead of the one who tried to tear you down. Carmen felt tears she'd been holding back for years finally spill over. Papa would be so proud of both of you right now. As the Colorado wind rustled through the cemetery's mature trees, 3 siblings stood together at their father's grave for the first time since his funeral, finally ready to have the conversations that should have happened years earlier. The healing wouldn't be simple or complete, but it had finally begun. Elena picked up her father's dog tags, the metal warm from the morning sun. Marcus, if you really want to understand military service, there's something you should know. The Army taught me that real strength isn't about never being afraid. It's about being afraid and choosing to serve anyway. Marcus nodded, recognizing wisdom that couldn't be learned in law school. Elena, will you teach me? About military life, about what Papa's service meant, about what yours means. Elena smiled, the first genuine smile Marcus had seen from her in 15 years. Yeah, Marcus, I can do that. The crisp October morning at Fort Carson carried the kind of clarity that made significant moments feel inevitable, rather than surprising. Elena stood before the mirror in her quarters, adjusting the 3 silver stars that had been pinned to her dress blue uniform 30 minutes earlier, in a private ceremony that transformed Major General Elena Reyes into Lieutenant General Elena Reyes, the youngest Latina woman to achieve 3-star rank in Army history. The reflection showed a woman whose shoulders had carried increasing responsibility with each promotion, whose bearing spoke to years of earning respect through competence rather than expectation. But today, for the first time in her military career, Elena's achievement felt complete, not because of institutional recognition, but because of the family members who would witness her public promotion ceremony. A knock at her door interrupted her preparation. Colonel Park entered with the precise timing that had characterized their professional partnership for nearly a decade. General, your family has arrived. They're being seated in the VIP section. Elena nodded, feeling a flutter of nervousness that had nothing to do with addressing hundreds of assembled personnel, and everything to do with the knowledge that Marcus and Carmen would be watching her receive recognition she'd earned through service they were only beginning to understand. How do they look? Park's expression carried the hint of a smile. Your brother appears appropriately proud and slightly overwhelmed by the ceremonial aspects. 6 months had passed since the cemetery conversation that had begun rebuilding their relationship. 6 months of weekly phone calls, shared family dinners when Elena's schedule permitted, and Marcus's growing understanding of military culture through questions that showed genuine interest rather than dismissive skepticism. The relationship remained careful, still tender in places where old wounds were healing, but it felt real in ways Elena had stopped hoping for years earlier. The promotion ceremony took place on the main parade field, where hundreds of soldiers stood in formation before a reviewing stand decorated with the flags of Elena's command. As she walked across the platform, Elena's gaze found her family in the VIP section, Carmen beaming with obvious pride, Marcus wearing dress clothes that suggested he'd taken this occasion seriously, and beside him, Sarah, whose presence represented the growing circle of family that felt increasingly stable. But it was Morrison's attendance that carried particular significance. The defense contractor CEO had requested permission to attend Elena's promotion ceremony, and seeing him seated near her family felt like validation of the professional relationships that had given her career meaning beyond personal achievement. General Patricia Williams, Elena's mentor and the officer conducting the promotion ceremony, stepped to the microphone with the bearing of someone whose own career had paved the way for moments like this. Ladies and gentlemen, we gather today to recognize exceptional leadership, strategic vision, and a commitment to service that exemplifies the finest traditions of the United States Army. Elena stood at attention as Williams read the citation that summarized her career progression. Combat deployments, command positions, innovations in logistics doctrine that had influenced military operations globally. The words felt surreal when spoken aloud, as if someone else's achievements were being described. Lieutenant General Elena Reyes has demonstrated the leadership qualities that make our army stronger, our operations more effective, and our soldiers better prepared for the challenges they face in service to our nation. As Williams pinned the third star to Elena's shoulder, the assembled formation erupted in applause that seemed to echo off the Colorado mountains. Elena's eyes found her family again, seeing Marcus applauding with an enthusiasm that would have been impossible to imagine 6 months earlier. Following the ceremony, the reception at the officers' club provided the first opportunity for Elena's family to interact with her military colleagues in a social setting. Elena watched Marcus navigate conversations with colonels and command sergeants major, his lawyer's social skills adapting to an environment where rank and combat experience carried more weight than educational credentials. General Reyes, Morrison approached with the warm respect that had characterized their professional relationship since Afghanistan. Outstanding ceremony. Well-deserved recognition. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. I'd like you to meet my family. Elena's voice carried a pride she'd never imagined feeling about introducing Marcus to professional colleagues. This is my brother Marcus, who's been handling your legal work with such skill. Morrison's face lit with the satisfaction of connecting professional relationships. Marcus! Elena never mentioned you were her brother. What a remarkable family you come from. Marcus shook Morrison's hand with genuine pleasure, rather than the networking calculation that had once characterized his professional interactions. Mr. Morrison, the pleasure is mine. I've learned more about military operations in the past 6 months than in 15 years of defense contracting law. Elena's been teaching you? Every chance she gets. Turns out there's a lot I didn't understand about what military service actually entails. Elena watched this exchange with amazement, seeing Marcus discuss her career with the kind of respect she'd stopped expecting from family members. The conversation continued, as Morrison shared stories about Elena's reputation in defense contracting circles, while Marcus listened with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested in understanding his sister's professional world. Later that evening, Elena's quarters hosted a family dinner that felt both celebratory and comfortably ordinary. Carmen had insisted on cooking, transforming Elena's military housing into something resembling their childhood home, with the addition of Rosa's recipes and Eduardo's favorite music playing softly in the background. To Elena, Marcus raised his wine glass, his expression carrying the solemnity of someone who'd learned to measure words carefully. For achieving recognition that honors not just your own service but Papa's dreams and the family legacy we're all still learning to understand. Elena felt tears she'd trained herself not to shed in professional settings. To family. And to new beginnings that don't erase the past but help us understand it better. As they shared stories about Eduardo's hidden military memorabilia and Rosa's secret pride in Elena's achievements, the conversation felt like family history being rewritten through adult understanding rather than childhood assumptions. Elena, Sarah said during dessert, her hand resting unconsciously on her still flat stomach. Marcus and I have news to share. Carmen's gasp of delight preceded the announcement by seconds. You're pregnant, Marcus nodded, his smile carrying the nervous excitement of prospective parenthood. We wanted you to be among the first to know. And Elena, we'd like you to be the baby's godmother. Elena felt her world shift in ways that had nothing to do with military promotion. The request represented trust that went beyond repairing their sibling relationship. It was invitation into the kind of family connection she'd thought she'd lost forever. I'd be honored, Elena said, her voice thick with emotion she no longer felt the need to hide from family. The following morning, the 3 siblings drove to Fairview Cemetery to visit Eduardo's grave, a tradition they'd established during their reconciliation process. Elena carried fresh flowers. Carmen brought a new photo of the family together at the promotion ceremony, and Marcus carried something that would have surprised his younger self: genuine respect for the military service that connected their father's generation to Elena's. Papa would have been so proud yesterday, Carmen said, arranging the flowers beside Eduardo's headstone. Elena knelt beside the grave, placing her new promotion orders next to the flowers. I think he would have been proud of all of us for figuring out how to be family again. Marcus stood behind his sisters, looking at the military insignia carved into their father's grave marker, with understanding that had taken 40 years to develop. Elena, I have something to tell you. I've started doing pro bono work with veteran legal services, helping soldiers navigate disability claims and family legal issues. Elena looked up at her brother with surprise that quickly shifted to admiration. Marcus, that's important work. It's work that matters. Like yours, just different. Marcus paused, choosing his words with the care he'd learned to apply to family conversations. I can't serve the way you do, but I can serve the people who serve. Maybe that's how I honor Papa's legacy. As they drove back to Fort Carson, Elena reflected on how completely her understanding of success had evolved. The third star on her shoulder represented institutional recognition of her military achievements, but the family relationships she'd rebuilt felt like the more significant accomplishment. 6 months earlier, she'd watched Marcus learn that his sister commanded respect in professional circles he'd never understood. Today, she was watching him find ways to serve the military community that honored both their father's sacrifices and his own capabilities. The transformation wasn't complete. Family healing never is, but it was real, sustainable, built on mutual respect rather than childhood roles that no longer fit the adults they'd become. Elena's phone buzzed with a text from Park. General, congratulations again on the promotion. Ready for tomorrow's strategic planning session? Elena smiled, typing her response. Ready for whatever comes next. For the first time in her adult life, that included family. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,